On July 26, 1953, two groups of men in the same uniform faced off in the early morning hour before sunrise. One group, who was supposed to be in uniform, were soldiers of the Cuban regime of Fulgencio Batista, who had seized power in Cuba the year before, with the tacit approval of the United States, which quite literally owned about half of the real estate, agriculture, and industry on the island and influenced the rest. The second group of soldiers, parked in suspicious-looking cars, were a group of fidgety young men in ill-fitting uniforms. As one of Batista's soldiers walked up to the lead car, a tall 26-year-old man in a suit and tie and looking like a country lawyer got out of the lead car facing them. Within a few seconds, Fidel Castro, not yet wearing his famed beard or the glasses he hated, had shot his first man. Not long afterward, at his trial for treason, Castro called the shooting a mistake, more likely because he had not given his men any clue what he was going to do. And within seconds, many of Castro's men were dead, wounded, or taken prisoner. Then because he took the man's life. At his widely publicized trial on October 16, 1953, Castro made a long speech rather than a testimony and uttered the words that helped make him famous. "History will absolve me." Castro's springboard to fame was built on the back of another man's lifeless body. Like other famous revolutionaries, like his comrade Che Guevara and men like Lenin, Fidel Castro grew up in a solidly middle-class conservative background. Like Stalin, Castro, who was born in 1926, and his brother and successor Raúl, born in 1931, were sent to church-run schools, in this case Jesuit, from an early age. Famous throughout the world for their academic rigor, the Jesuit schools were also renowned for their discipline, which consisted of heavy doses of emotional and psychological manipulation, along with their well-known physical punishments. The punishments meted out in Latin American Jesuit schools for much of the 20th century would make up enough for another A Day in History video. But suffice it to say that caning and paddling, not just of the backsides, but the hands and occasionally the feet, were not the only punishments doled out by priests or older boys. Boxing the ears and causing concussion was another. This was the personal world in which Fidel Castro and his brother grew up. Outside the Jesuit schools, Cuba was a tropical paradise owned by a minority. And most of those were Americans or large American conglomerates with incomes greater than those of many countries in the early 20th century. Having removed the Spanish from Cuba in 1898–99, American interests quickly moved in to take advantage of cheap, abundant labor and plentiful sugar, which the United States had a seemingly unending taste for both rum and sweets. Cuban cattle and railroad interests were dominated by Americans or their Cuban proxies. Congress also passed the Platt Amendment, which unilaterally legalized American control over Cuban interests, especially foreign policy. Nothing in Cuba truly changed after the American victory in the Spanish-American War. That's not to imply that everything bad that happened in Cuba at that time was due to the Americans. No, there were plenty of Cubans and even some Spanish holdouts who were more than happy to get their piece of the pie. At the bottom were millions of laborers, fishermen, miners, and others, living on an impoverished tropical island that was susceptible to hurricanes and disease. There had been rebellions in Cuba before, mostly slave rebellions from the time of the Spanish Main and the era of pirates, but all had failed and had been put down brutally. Just before the outbreak of the Spanish-American War in 1898, José Martí began a rebellion against Spanish rule, which was widely known to be cruel, racist, and incredibly corrupt. Martí was killed a month into his rebellion, and the goals of the revolt were not reached even after the war ended in 1899. But it had been inspiring to many, including Fidel Castro, who claimed the mantle of Martí in his 1953 speech. To a large degree, Cuba before Castro remained constant. Despite who ruled and despite the promises they made, History, culture, foreign interference, and a huge dose of corruption combined to make Cuba a paradise for a few, where many people never even dreamed of getting rich because it would never happen. For many working-class Cubans and others who saw things as they really were in the country, the socialist revolutions in the Soviet Union and post-World War I in Central and Eastern Europe were an inspiration. Still, it was almost as dangerous in pre-Castro Cuba to speak your mind as it was afterwards. In the last half of the 1940s, Castro was one of many rough and ready students who were not only passionate about their politics, but were violent about it as well. Low-level political warfare, in the form not only of secret newspapers, posters and pamphlets, but meetings, and the violent breakups of rivals' meetings and more, was part of what was called gangsterismo, an ultra-macho attitude that went along with knives, brass knuckles, and hidden revolvers. Fidel and Raúl were part of that, with Fidel by far the more fiery and outspoken. The life of what we might call a political gangster was not easy in Cuba. Both the Jesuit schools and the few colleges in Cuba were places the authorities kept an eye on. If there were anyone susceptible and capable of starting a revolution, they would likely be on the college campuses or nearby, whether teachers or students. Not all student gangs were leftist. Some ultra-Catholic, anti-leftist groups were put together by the police or school authorities to spy on the other students. Castro and the others began to learn the ways of secrecy and discipline years before their revolution. History books today in both the US and Cuba portray a similar image of the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, born 1901 to 1973, a corrupt, petty dictator who treated Cuba as his personal treasury, by allowing himself and his government to be bought by foreign interests, including the American mafia. Most American texts rightly point out that Batista was indeed corrupt, and that many of the things he did in the short time he was in power ensured that the Cuban population was ready for revolution when it came. What most US texts miss is that Batista's regime was notorious for the human rights abuses and outright torture that took place during its short time in power. They also often fail to mention that to many Cubans, Batista's regime was not that much different than what had come before it. It's just that the Cuban people had had enough. The police under Batista were notorious for their treatment of prisoners and suspects. Since the entire regime was based on corruption, many real criminals could get off, or get more lenient sentences if they paid off the right people. It was the system and always had been. But what concerned the police more were men and women who wanted to overthrow the system. And that meant Batista's police and military. And that meant no more money, promotions, or perks. Torture was a double-edged sword in pre-Castro Cuba. It could be personal and it could be political. What many people saw was that the people who wanted to change the system were tortured, and criminals who preyed on the populace were let go. What's more, the police were not shy about using torture. It was not a hidden thing. Batista's police used all the typical methods: mock executions, beatings, electrocutions, sexual assault, and carbonización, the turning of the feet and/or hands, or parts of them, into charcoal by burning them with a blowtorch or pressing hot metal into them. The Batista regime was hated. The only people who liked it were those who made money from it, and when the money got threatened by Castro's revolution, there was no loyalty to the regime to prop it up. While Castro and Che Guevara did organize a brilliant guerrilla campaign that not only defeated Batista's forces quickly, they did it with comparatively few losses. And what's more, established a legend as successful revolutionaries that not only ended Batista's regime, but fired up millions of peasants and revolutionaries throughout the world. Within hours of the regime falling on January 1st, 1959, the Castro brothers and Guevara, like they had throughout their campaign, ordered the executions of regime police. Suspected informers, people who worked in companies with direct ties to the regime, officers, and others alleged to be anti-leftist or anti-revolution. We know that Guevara personally shot several men and ordered the deaths of dozens of others. Raúl ordered more and is thought to have shot several victims. The information on Fidel is sketchy, but suffice it to say that there was and is nothing to suggest that Castro himself shot any men at all, though he did, without doubt, give orders to. When Castro took over, many people expected and wanted a reckoning, and they got it. Throughout the country, but especially in Havana, men and women who were identified as working for or with the Batista regime were rounded up, not only by Castro's forces, but by ordinary citizens looking for revenge. Their battle cry was "Paredon," to the wall, and 100 were killed on the behest of mobs, some probably bent on personal revenge only. Several police and military personnel were beaten to death. A couple were torn apart. No one was exactly sure where Castro would take the country. Sometimes he spoke like a traditional Cuban revolutionary, talking about simple justice for farmers and workers. Sometimes he went on and on talking about political theory, which he did endlessly to the end of his life. Castro was famous for speeches or tirades that lasted for literally hours. What Castro and Guevara did know was that no matter what form their government took, they weren't simply going to wage another half-baked Latin American revolution, so that they could now loot the country like so many others had. No, Fidel, Che, and the others at the top were going to change Cuba from the top to the bottom. Once they realized that the United States was going to do everything it could to destabilize or overthrow the new regime, Castro and Guevara, who had been a committed communist for far longer than Fidel, completely threw in their lot with the Soviet Union and the Communist bloc. That included their methods of repression, perfected over decades. Within a short time, the Cuban state security building earned a new and even more ominous reputation. Cubans were somewhat used to the police working them over. Bruises and broken bones were not unusual. Burns were, but generally speaking, that was saved for people who had really found themselves in hot water with the police. What Castro did was more insidious. Soviet experts, along with former Cuban intelligence men who had wisely switched sides to join the revolution, and simple thugs went to work devising new sorts of punishments and re-education techniques to ensure that not only was the Cuban population propped up by the joy of overthrowing a corrupt regime, but that the groundwork for total obedience was laid. One of the more popular forms of torture in Cuba was isolation. In Soviet Russia and several German concentration camps, there were isolation cells. In Cuba, these cells were more like coffins. Sometimes they were completely dark. Sometimes the lights inside it were never turned off. There was not enough room to turn over. Often, these cells were in basements, as you can imagine. Cockroaches and spiders were common, and were often intentionally placed inside cells to torment prisoners. Some prisoners were kept in them for months. The infections, diseases, and starvation were unimaginable. Insanity sometimes ensued. Throughout their confinement, prisoners were questioned, which often meant being beaten and shocked with electricity. Then back in the cells. If they left, they were told not to tell anyone about what happened. But the police knew they would. They counted on it to terrify the population into compliance. The punishments were not just physical. Throughout the country, Castro and the regime ordered or encouraged the familiar struggle sessions that were so popular in communist China at the time. Men, women, college students, teachers, landlords, writers, etc. were often dragged from their homes or cells to large public meetings, where they were forced to admit their counter-revolutionary crimes. All the while, they would be held in painful positions, have objects thrown at them, and be beaten and threatened. In the early days, a number were beaten to death. Many survivors have said that these moments were the most terrifying of their lives. no one was sure if they were going to be torn limb from limb. Within a short time, the new regime had co-opted old Batista army camps and jails to use as re-education camps, where the most stubborn holdouts of the old culture were held and where new opponents were funneled. Like camps in other repressive countries, Cuba's camps were places of relentless work in the tropical, malaria-ridden swamps and heat. Hundreds died from disease. Others were worked to death. Outside the camps, Castro, with the help of Soviet KGB specialists and advisors, set up a communist police state. By the early 1960s, the regime had organized Cuban society to such a degree that there was virtually no time for people to spend with their families or on their own. Throughout Cuba, and especially in Havana, people's entire schedule was made for them. It consisted of work. A 40-hour workweek was the standard. But it was expected, especially at the start of the revolution, that people would volunteer work hours over and above work. And if you did not, it was noticed. Almost every apartment and public building in Cuba had informers working for the government. These informants couldn't just sit idly by either and tell the police or party officials that nothing had happened that week. They were expected to name names, so that's what they did. And if you were a person who was seen to be against the revolution or didn't take it seriously, you might get a warning visit from the local party leader. A cop or the secret police might deliver the next warning. There usually were warnings after the second. If you tried to live your life without running into trouble with the regime, you did the following: kept your head down, kept your mouth shut, and did what you were told. Many people forget this, but Castro and the Cuban regime, especially in the 60s, were masters of propaganda and public rallies and displays. For most people, they were initially a popular way to show off the success of the revolution and to display to the Yankees, the hated Americans, that Cuba was an independent and free nation. For many years, the Castro regime was popular. But over time, the stagnation of the Soviets, who provided most of Cuba's foreign aid, and the constant attempts by the regime to coerce people into greater and greater efforts, while the country was mismanaged and isolated from most modern developments, began to take a toll. By the early 1980s, Cuba was in real trouble. The Soviet Union propped the country up with military, technological, and economic aid. But it couldn't keep up with the needs of all its client states, plus Cuba. Soon, life in Cuba, always hard, became much more difficult. Electrical shortages, water shortages, food shortages, and lack of medicine, unless you paid someone for it on the black market, all were taking a heavy toll. More people turned to crime, and many decided to flee the country. The exodus of Cubans to Florida is famous. See the 1983 movie Scarface. But what is not so well known, at least in the USA, were the orders of the Cuban Navy to make life as difficult for the escapees as possible. Hundreds were arrested on the beach or just offshore. Most were taken to open-air camps where they were left exposed to the elements. Many died or were killed by police or criminal gangs. In 1994, the 13 de Marzo, 13th of March, a tugboat which was trying to escape Havana harbor with refugees crowded on and in it, was rammed by a Cuban Navy frigate, killing 35 to 40 people, including children. The ramming had been ordered at the top level. Fidel Castro stepped down from power due to health issues and handed over the government to his brother Raúl. Until he died in 2016, he remained the eccentric elder statesman of world radicalism, going on TV to make random 3 or 4-hour speeches, which were required watching, and ranting over the state of the world. When he died on November 25, 2016, the Cuban intelligence service had already begun to deploy a new weapon against members of the US diplomatic mission in Havana. What is suspected to be a directed microwave weapon which causes headache, disorientation, lack of memory, and more. It's believed that before he died, Castro ordered the development and deployment of the weapon. Thank you for watching. See you next time